Dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack and flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yo, what's good, original crew, man? We're back with another visual, man. We got a Mr. Bolin. He gave his lawyer $10,000 to solve his own murder. Ooh. Sound like a true crime mystery, don't it? Mm-hmm. You good? Mm-hmm. You
Why wouldn't I be?
You sleepy?
I'm always sleeping.
You tired? Oh, she's tired, y'all. It's gonna be all right.
But I'm fine.
With that being said, before we get into it, make sure y'all check out the links in the description box.
Down below.
You already know where to go. If you want to first support, you got to do it. Check out down below. Also, if you enjoyed today's video,
like it in with a thumbs up.
Also, always, man, shout out to the comment of the day.
Shout out to you.
Y'all keep running us up in the comments, man, so I can keep
Please.
shouting y'all out, man. Dang. Come on. But let's go. Let's check this out. Let's see what's about. You ready?
Yeah.
One day in the spring of 2006, a detective stood next to a refrigerator in her police station holding a container of evidence. She knew that what she was about to do with this evidence was a breach of protocol and could definitely get her in a lot of trouble. But that was not going to stop her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry. But just fold all their dirty clothes and give it back to them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush and told her to come back in 6 months. Then he headed into his back office to pack up. Once he'd gathered up all his things, he walked out through the reception area and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved and gave John a big smile. However, as soon as John actually left the building, the smile faded from his face. Because in reality, he had a lot of problems right now, and pretending to be happy all day was actually really exhausting. And so John walked across the lot, climbed into his car, and then began the half-mile drive from his dental practice to his house. So John had actually grown up in Blairsville, and it had been his lifelong dream to raise a family here. So when he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and very likely made a higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he joined the practice of his own childhood dentist right in downtown Blairsville. And it would actually turn out that John was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. This dental practice really took off, in part because John himself was really charming and great with kids, and so lots of families wanted to come here. And so what John had done is, with the extra money he was making, basically above and beyond what he expected, he took that extra money and invested it into real estate and became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. However, it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that he really felt like he had made it in life. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children, and to John, this was actually perfect, because it meant that she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were sort of worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when John's mom got sick with cancer, Michelle took on the responsibility of being her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof that he ever needed that Michelle truly cared for him. And so the pair got married in 1997, and they actually adopted a little boy named JJ shortly after their marriage. And so altogether, they had 3 children. And together, this new big family moved into this big house with a pool and a hot tub. It was like everything was perfect. However, now, as John arrived back home and pulled into the driveway of his very modest home, and he sat there just staring at this new place he was currently living, he just thought to himself, like, how had everything fallen apart so completely? These days, John was very tight on money. He'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people because he was quite generous, but now he was having to ask for it back because he literally needed the money. And then on the marriage side, he and Michelle had hit this horrible rough patch that just didn't end, and they both admitted they had had affairs, and so now they were living separately, which was why John was here at this little house instead of coming home to the big family house with the pool and the hot tub. However, the financial stress and the marital stress, as bad as they were not nearly as bad as a third stressor in John's life. And that was that John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. Now, this all started 2 weeks earlier when somebody vandalized John's car with spray paint. And the police looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And, objectively, having your car spray painted, vandalized in some way does not, therefore mean someone's trying to kill you. But he just had this feeling that this felt really personal, like somebody was targeting him. And so eventually, over several days, John went from my car got vandalized to my car got vandalized and it makes me feel like someone's trying to kill me. And John believed this so completely that he actually went to his attorney and gave her $10,000 just in case he wound up dead. She could use that to investigate his murder. Now, John got out of his car and he walked up his porch steps and into his home, and he closed the door and locked it behind him. And right away, John just felt like this house, it's already so depressing, but it was so quiet because nobody was here. I mean, he wished his adopted son JJ was here because he would have made the whole house just feel alive. But, these days, John didn't see JJ very much. He would go long stretches between visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room, and there on the coffee table, he saw a legal document that he had been avoiding. That document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, in 2003, but she and John had not been able to actually come to an agreement. Now, to be clear, they were not fighting to save the marriage. Like, the marriage was done. Michelle was actually already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. However, what John and Michelle had been fighting over, which had caused this divorce to drag on, was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, but John didn't want to give up his son. However, John knew in less than 24 hours, this would all finally be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had already signed the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so John took a seat on the couch and turned on the TV. But he couldn't even focus, he was just too restless. So instead, he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce and about the custody agreement. And then eventually, when they said their goodbyes, John hung up, he stretched out on the couch, and he fell asleep right there. The next day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, could come out and play. He wasn't sure if JJ would actually be around, since JJ did split time between his mother and his father's place, but, he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach reached the front steps to John and JJ's house, he stopped, because he saw there was this little glass panel to the left of the front door that had been broken, shattered. There was glass on the porch. And also, Zach could see streaks of what looked like red liquid that had dried underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. I mean, he sees this and thinks it's blood. He wants to turn and run away. But he thought about his friend JJ, and he was worried that maybe he was in some kind of trouble, so he couldn't just abandon him. And so, sort of mustering all the courage he could, Zach slowly and very nervously climbed the rest of the steps to the front door, and he tried the doorknob, but he found the door was locked. And so as carefully as he could, Zach actually reached his hand through that broken panel to the left of the door, being careful not to cut himself, and he reached inside the house and unlocked the door from the inside, and then he opened it up. And as soon as he stepped into the house, he saw there were papers strewn everywhere, and there was a body laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 children when she got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, But the details were still a bit confusing. Dispatch just said there had been a cardiac arrest and that Corporal Leidick was needed at the scene. There was no other information available. So, thinking the call was sort of a run-of-the-mill heart attack, Leidick, with her family, just drove straight over there. However, when she actually pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she could tell that this was not a heart attack. She saw there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Leidick walked over to him, and he immediately pointed out that broken glass and the blood that, appeared to be stained to the ground. And so she asked him, what's going on here? I was told this was a cardiac arrest. And all he said was, it's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself. So Leidick, she turned and waved to her husband and kids, sort of signaling everything's fine, just give me a minute. And then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was sort of struck by what she saw. I mean, the whole foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls. And there, in the center of it, amongst, all these papers strewn about, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen. Now, Leidick had never actually worked a homicide before, but she knew, as she tried and failed to count the number of stab wounds on this man's body, that what she was looking at here was definitely not cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup because, this call had been recorded erroneously as a cardiac arrest, but what that meant is the police had not sent a full emergency response. And so Leidick and this other patrol officer were the only people on scene. Leidick was afraid the killer or killers could still be in the area, or maybe even in this house. They hadn't even secured the house yet. And she's thinking she brought her kids and her husband with her. So she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house, and then she went back out into the front yard to basically stand guard between the murder scene and her family with her hand on the gun in her holster. Luckily though, it wasn't long before Leidick heard a bunch of emergency sirens approaching in the distance. Also, at the same time, that patrol officer came out of the house to tell Leidick that it was empty. So the killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery this officer had made was he had found a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim had bled through from the floor above. And so at this point, Leidick said bye to her husband and her kids, and she sent them home. And then she went back into detective mode and went back inside the house. It was around this point that somebody on scene told Leidick what the victim's name was. They said his name was John Yelnick. And so as the crime scene technicians began their work processing the physical evidence inside the house, Leidick began a slow walk through each of the rooms inside the home, trying to get a sense of who John was, and also how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been very long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also strewn with divorce papers. John's body was also found barefoot. However, there were bloody shoe prints in the house, and these prints were far too big to belong to that little boy who found the body, Zach. So Leidick figured they must belong to the killer or killers. And so the crime scene techs were already measuring the prints to try to determine the killer's shoe size. As Leidick continued walking through the house, she didn't see anything that at least overtly looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The TV hadn't been taken, no drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and so on. And to Leidick, this actually made sense. I mean, the murder appeared to be extremely violent and so very likely quite personal, which suggested that whoever the killer was, or killers, the only thing they had really wanted when they entered this home was apparently for John to die horribly. She finished her sweep of the scene, ending up in the living room where it looked to her like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table, right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and note were from somebody named Melissa Use. And when Leidick saw that, she did a double take. Use was the last name of the neighborhood boy, Zach, who had discovered John's body. And so Leidick wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, the boy. And so now Corporal Leidick realized that here on the coffee table, she had her first two legitimate leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a divorce. Right. And someone, maybe his next door neighbor, if Melissa was connected to Zach, owed him a lot of money that apparently she couldn't quite afford to pay back in one go, that she had to tell John to don't cash this right away. It was evening by the time Lydic finally stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw there was a group of neighbors and reporters jostling around each other out on the street. So Blairsville almost never had murders, and so Lydic knew this was obviously going to be a huge story. But for now, as much as she knew she was going to get hounded by reporters as she passed by them, she just needed to keep on walking because she had to get back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow, like with suspects. However, before she could even walk down the front steps, one of the other officers on scene came over to her with an update. Over the last few hours, the police had fanned out across the neighborhood to speak to people to see if anybody had seen or heard anything unusual. And the police had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, so technically early that same morning, she had woken up to the sound of a scream. And so she sat up, she heard the scream, but she said the screaming didn't continue, and so she had ultimately just gone back to bed. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time the previous night. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling in what sounded like a very heated argument. Now, the neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." And so instantly, when Lydic heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. Like, this seems to add more credibility to the idea that maybe money was behind this. However, the officer said he wasn't done. He said he had one more important piece of information for Lydic. In addition to the witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really ought to look into. And that was the Use family. Because word around the neighborhood was that Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Lydic was at the police station, sitting at a table inside of an interrogation room across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Now again, Lydic had never done a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for interrogating her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though they were not her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife Michelle and her new boyfriend Kevin, for the simple reason that in a murder case, from what she'd been told, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Lydic had sent an officer to tell Michelle that her soon-to-be ex-husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, she already knew, although she said that she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So this officer had to break the news to Michelle and also her new boyfriend Kevin that this was actually a murder, and they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Lydic actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin personally because he was a state police trooper. They had actually worked together. But now, Lydic was going to have to investigate her colleague, Kevin, because he's one of the suspects, which was obviously very touchy, especially amongst cops. And so what Lydic wanted to do was gather more information, before she spoke to Michelle and Kevin. First, what she wanted to do was rule the Uses out as suspects, and she wanted to also get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Lydic looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. And Lydic began by asking them what the deal was with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John that was found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since about 9th grade, and she was planning to open a new bakery in town. And John had just loaned her $15,000 to help her out with that. But then sort of out of nowhere, he'd asked for the money back. Melissa said she'd been really disappointed when he did this, but she also knew John was in the middle of a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said that she had only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check, and so that's why she had also left that note for John along with the check, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she got that last $1,000 together. Lydic watched Melissa closely as she said all this. She did seem truly distraught over John's death, and that the money really didn't seem like a big issue to her at all relative to John's death. But for Lydic, the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question here. And she decided that she really just couldn't dance around it, even though Melissa was literally sitting next to her husband, Tom. Lydic looked right at Melissa and asked her straight out, was she having an affair with John? Melissa immediately flushed and and said no. And she said they'd been close friends, but really nothing more. At this point, Lydic turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and just asked him the same thing. Was his wife having an affair with John? And for a second, Tom just went quiet. But then when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. And he basically refused to answer the question. And instead, he just kept repeating that he really had to go take care of his kids now. Now, Lydic knew this had been a very blunt thing to ask, but Tom's reaction to this question was really suspicious. And so by the time Lydic told Melissa and Tom that they could go, Tom had firmly established himself in Lydic's mind as a clear person of interest. Before Lydic left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers who she had sent to go observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular had been cut by glass. And John also had defensive wounds on his hands, as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he had at one point tried to run away. I mean, Lydic already knew this, but to hear the details from the autopsy just reinforced how truly brutal this murder was. And so what Lydic thought after hearing these details was, wow, whoever did this must have truly hated John. And Lydic's already thinking, I already have one suspect in Tom Use, whose wife might have been having an affair with John. Certainly that would be enough to inspire Tom to hate John. Despite Lydic's, obvious inexperience with murder cases, she felt really confident at this point that she'd be able to solve this, as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, like she always had on every case she had worked in. However, the case was already getting a lot of attention in the news, and so Lydic knew there would be pressure to show results fast. If she moved too slowly, this case might either get taken away from her, or another police agency might get called in to help to speed it up. Now, Lydic didn't want that to happen, but she also really didn't want to compromise her methodical investigative process either, and so she figured she would have to strike a balance. That officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Lydic was supposed to send off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Lydic decided, now that she had these samples, that she was not going to do that. Lydic really wanted to keep her investigatory options open and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence in this case. And so after Lydic got these samples and after this officer had left, she went to the department refrigerator and put them in there, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, so 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Lydic had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members, and they'd painted John generally as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Lydic was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as Lydic arrived at John's office, she was glad she had decided to go there, because the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. And this was because during that long, multi-year fight John and Melissa had over their divorce, Michelle had at one point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family had not believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. And so John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She also called the office regularly to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. But actually, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to speak to her. And this detail definitely caught Lydic's ear. It was not just the, colleagues at the dental practice that said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said that. They said it was Michelle who wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. But John really had never felt comfortable with that, flashy lifestyle. And to many of John's friends and colleagues, it was that contrast between he and Michelle that ultimately sort of drove them apart. And so Lydic began to wonder, maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money a few days before his murder, where Michelle's calling, trying to demand money. John's not taking her call. Could that have been enough to inspire Michelle to murder John? Maybe. But also what Leidig discovered is that Michelle was actually listed as a beneficiary of John's life insurance plan. And so if John died, she stood to inherit literally millions of dollars. Wow. And so now there's like a twofold financial reason for Michelle to want to bring harm to John, basically all because of money. But it didn't seem possible that Michelle would be capable of overpowering John and delivering all those stab wounds and killing him. It just seemed like John would be able to fight her off if she was the killer. But Leidig thought, maybe Michelle hired somebody else to do it, somebody else that was much larger and more physical. She certainly had the money to do that. And so as Leidig left the dental office, she began to think about how she was actually going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidig did not want to make her move too soon without enough ammunition first. This was not just the first murder case she had worked. This was, the first murder case and the biggest case, period, that she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she didn't want to screw anything up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, so 6 days after the murder. And Corporal Leidig knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get pretty antsy about why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But, Leidig did understand where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure, just very public pressure to solve this thing right away. And so that was weighing on friends and family. And also, John himself, before he was killed, had this paranoia that he was going to be murdered. And now he's turned up dead. It just seemed like a crazy coincidence, or that John knew something, that this really was a prediction that came true. But Leidig also felt like John's friends and family just didn't understand why this was taking the time it was taking. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, Leidig had developed a very, careful method of her own. And for the next several months, Leidig continued to follow her protocol, and she did take her time, but again, with intention. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Leidig's suspects. And so for now, Leidig was really relying heavily on interviews. And Leidig, she would run down every single tip and rumor that she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her three best suspects, Tom Hughes, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's own family about, her failure to solve this case more quickly did get to her, but she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Hughes, so John's alleged affair partner and next-door neighbor, hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, so about 3 months after the murder, when Leidig got a call from Melissa. Leidig had actually been pretty surprised to hear from her, and then even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. And then when Leidig showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with these two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said that she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about the case. And Leidig was really not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter John's house. But Leidig also knew that John's family was getting really edgy. And if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics contacted by one of the suspects' wives, then that was what Leidig was going to do. And so Leidig followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and began saying they felt hot and cold patches, and, Leidig is doing her best not to roll her eyes. And then when they went into the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder, and so was still splattered with blood, the psychic sisters had a premonition that told them the killing had happened in the dining room area. And then the psychic said they saw a knife, and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and they said the killer drove a black or red car, and that the killer was not Melissa Yuce's husband, Tom. Now, Melissa, as she listened to the psychic speak, she seemed really excited by this, but Leidick thought it was all ridiculous. The blood that they were literally looking at inside the home made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things the psychics were saying were easy to learn before showing up here. These are not revelations. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had brought here and hired, were now exonerating Melissa's husband was not very convincing. And so as the group finally left the house, the only thing Leidick thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But what they didn't know is she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, so 10 months after the murder. And at this point, Corporal Leidick finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation. Leidick's cooperation with those psychics had bought her a little time, but ultimately both John's family and Melissa Yuce had gotten more and more agitated by Leidick's very slow pace. They felt like the psychics had basically given them as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed, which meant Leidick was losing her case. And on the one hand, this was quite literally the exact thing that Leidick had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency that Leidick had expected. And so now, even though this definitely stung, Leidick realized that she could actually finally make that play she'd been sitting on for almost a year. And so Leidick went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out that little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick that her officer had brought to her after John's autopsy. She had been told she needed to send these samples off to the state police crime lab pretty much right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, Leidick had decided to not do that and instead put these samples in the fridge and wait. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case way more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidick to send these samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a higher rung on the hierarchy. Now, normally the FBI would never take samples from sort of a small town murder case, but now that it was this huge public case, national news, Leidick knew she could take advantage. So she repackaged those fingernail clippings and the other samples, and she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back in, Leidick was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading, because her strategy of intentionally slow playing this investigation and sitting on this evidence until right now had totally paid off. Finally, Leidick on her computer was looking at the name of John's killer.
That's what I'm talking about.
Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early morning hours of April 13th, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer climbed out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching, but it was dark and silent. So, the killer left the street and walked around to the back of this home and then slipped inside of it through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they walked right up to John, and they raised the blade up and then brought it down directly onto John. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming, and he put his hands up to try to protect himself, and he even tried clawing at the killer, getting the killer's skin under his fingernails. And so John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. John eventually got up and sort of began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down, and the two began to wrestle. And as they're struggling and the killer is stabbing John, John's flailing his arms around, and he eventually hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, throwing them everywhere. And then eventually, somehow, just on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. John eventually did make it to the front foyer, and he actually reached for the front door, but the killer actually shoved John as he did that, and John went flying towards that pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head went through the glass, and when his head went through, some of the glass severed his jugular, and then John bled to death right there. The killer watched until John was totally still.
Shut up.
At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood right back out the door. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because the killer knew people trusted them with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. And the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Leidick had decided not to send all of that evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Leidick knew Kevin, and she liked him, and she basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Kevin seemed to hate John, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin ultimately believed them. And so Leidick had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer, and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Kevin was guilty here, well, she couldn't really trust the State Police Crime Lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would get involved, find out, and he would cover it up. It just was too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence to the State Crime Lab. So Leidick had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she'd kept the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time, until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case, and Leidick then got access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists did finally test the DNA that was found under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. And so in the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never actually charged in connection with the case.
So she still get away with what she wanted at the end of the day.
Was John's money.
And full custody.
And full custody of JJ. Ain't that
And
bad?
I wonder, did she truly care about getting full custody of JJ, or she just wanted to continue to hurt him?
Yeah.
Because also, she wanted possibly full custody of JJ because for financial reasons.
True.
With the possibility of possibility of child support. I'm sure he had to possibly pay alimony.
Yeah.
I'm sure but he still, the fact that she still wanted to take the son, she still wanted to hurt him. Mm-hmm. And even if she did inquire him she knew that man went over there and did that.
Yeah.
But did she know prior? That's gonna be up to debate. But
still, even if you knew after, I'm still like, yeah, you may not know prior, and if you did, like you said, it's debatable. But even if you knew after the fact, and you still didn't say nothing,
the divorce wasn't 100% finalized, was it?
Not yet, because he hadn't signed his yet. It was going the next day. He had to sign his portion, especially like with the custody and stuff and all that.
And it's just a coincidence this night's the night you go do that? This night?
True.
That's just a coincidence? So you got to think about it after that. Now she is legit his deceased widow. Mm-hmm. The divorce is not finalized. So she gains every asset he has. If he still had real estate, she gains all that. The money he has in his account, she gets all that. The life insurance, millions. She became a mega millionaire after the fact due to all that.
It sucks.
You see how sick, man. And then you put and can that happen about like the divorce can be ugly. Who you marry is not who you divorce. Not
True.
at all.
True. And I think
Or in some cases, who you divorce is who you marry, but they never showed you that person. Reason why but that was always them. They just always was lying about. Because you remember, like he even said, a lot of his family and friends thought that she only wanted him for the money. So she's going to do whatever it takes to make everything look good.
Mm-hmm.
But she was always who she was. She just played the long-term game. She got the house, possibly the cars. Now she wants,
Money.
Want the money without having to do anything for it. For real. Because she never even had his kids. Even though they adopted, they shared a kid.
Yeah.
Man, people can be very sick-minded, though.
That definitely is. Even with coming up with false allegations.
And then
if it didn't happen, you know what I'm saying? Which, nothing ever
came about
or was found to, for that to be. So why would you? I think that's sick in itself. Especially this is something that y'all did together. This is all that JJ know. Like, this is his father. And so for you to keep him away, like, that's sick in itself. And I hate when people do that. But yeah.
Cause we was just talking about, I just had told you about a situation back home like that. Mm-hmm. Like, why put that on someone when you know that don't happen?
Yeah.
Like, you know how fucked up you have to be in a,
because you have grown to like hate this person or whatever. So now you like using, I don't know. People are sick. People are really sick and really evil. Deep down. Yeah. Rest in peace to John.
Yeah. That you know how tragic that is to go out. I'm asleep in my home.
In my home.
Not bothering nobody. You come in and you took an oath to protect and serve.
And you go and break in his house like that.
And he trying to.
And take his life.
Boy, he went out bad. That's a bad way to go out. And then I hate it for the Zach.
Oh, the
having
little
to
boy,
see
having
that.
having to see, yes.
Cause you must have got him from the glass frame and moved him back into the home.
Mm-hmm. Drug him back. Well, they said he was found by the front door.
But yeah, more in like because Zach he opened the door and he still had to walk in and bend the corner.
And the fact that you 9 times out of 10, because I'm just gonna say that you like just waited. Like, how long did you stay after the fact, like for him to like bleed out? Like that's evil.
Very.
You are really evil and cold-hearted.
Don't care. Sick individual, man. But y'all spend most up, man. These dudes doing anything for the. That's crazy. Let us know y'all thoughts down below for us. But until next time, y'all know how it go, man. I do go over the name DJ No Kid. This is
Sierra Nicole.
We are.
Kid and
We out.
Ain't no time to kick it, got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my pocket.